In a secluded corner of the bookstore, Tom was engrossed in a book when Sandra unexpectedly entered. She was on the hunt for a particular book, and Tom kindly assisted her. Finding himself fond of Sandra, Tom extended an invitation for dinner at a Japanese restaurant on Mott Street, but she politely declined. To cover her purchase, Sandra handed over her card, only to discover it was declined. Tom offered to let her take the book and turn to pay later. Grateful for the kindness, Sandra accepted his offer and left. As Tom was closing the bookstore, Sandra approached him and handed over the payment for the book. After that, they exchanged names, and with a smile, Sandra expressed a change of heart, deciding she'd like to have dinner with him after all. Tom and Sandra enjoyed a pleasant conversation over dinner, and during their chat, Sandra mentioned her fluency in Italian and her time studying in Italy. She also shared that reading Jane Eyre had a profound impact on her, as it mirrored her life story and sparked her love for books. After dinner, Tom took Sandra back to the bookstore and showed her a first edition of Jane Eyre, which leaves Sandra speechless. Their shared passion for literature and the magical moment led to an intimate kiss. Subsequently, they began to spend more time together, strengthening their bond, and it eventually blossomed into a meaningful and deep relationship. On Tom's birthday, Sandra expressed her desire to visit his house since they always met at her place, and she'd never been to his before. Tom hesitated, explaining that his home wasn't comfortable. He lived with his dad and his new wife, with whom he had a strained relationship. Tom felt like a disappointment to his father, who was also seriously ill. One day, Tom, worried about Sandra's lack of response to his texts, paid her a visit at her house. Sandra confided in him, revealing that her brother was facing a dire situation, burdened by an overwhelming debt of $350,000, and he had been assaulted by the creditors. Surprisingly, Tom offered to provide Sandra with the money to settle her brother's debt, mentioning that his father had substantial resources. Sandra was taken aback, having believed Tom was just a bookstore worker, but he revealed he owned the bookstore. Sandra hesitated, but ultimately accepted Tom's offer, promising to repay him no matter how long it took. However, after that day, Sandra disappeared without a trace, leaving her home and breaking Tom's heart. On a chilly Christmas Eve, Sandra walked through a dimly lit alley and entered a bar. She had to meet LaRusso, a corrupt police who turned out to be her parole officer. It is unveiled that Sandra is a parolee with a lengthy criminal record. LaRusso wasted no time and asked if she had indulged in drugs or violated her parole in any way. Sandra, despite her criminal past, shook her head firmly and replied with a resounding no. Suspiciously, LaRusso pressed her for a compelling reason not to bring her back into custody. Sandy, in a last-ditch effort, offered a substantial sum of money. However, LaRusso, filled with disappointment, ultimately made the difficult decision to return Sandra to prison. Out of nowhere, Max abruptly approached their table, berating LaRusso as an asshole. LaRusso, taken aback, inquired about Max's intentions. Max, seemingly unfazed, offered LaRusso money and his Rolex watch to leave Sandra alone. LaRusso dismissed him as possibly drunk, to which Max playfully concurred before departing. Outside, LaRusso intercepted Max as he entered his car, requesting a conversation and proposed a deal. She wanted Max's Rolex watch in exchange for her leaving Sandy alone. Max then reluctantly handed over the watch, and LaRusso departed. After that, Sandy joined Max in his car, and they left the bar together, eventually arriving at Max's apartment. He then presented her with a choice to stay and work for him or leave, as she pleased. The next day, right after Sandra woke up, Max revealed his plan to transform her into someone entirely different. Someone so convincing that people would believe her false identity without a doubt. Max took on the role of her mentor, teaching her sophistication and refinement, molding her into a better version of her former self. He even coached her in speaking Italian, adding a fabricated backstory of studying in Italy to complete the charade. One night, Max takes Sandra to a luxurious bar to celebrate his birthday. Max commends Sandra, impressed by her progress, and deems her ready for a test run. He then instructs her to lure a man from the bar back to his apartment. Following promptly, Sandra approaches a man at the bar, offering to buy him a drink, to which he agrees. Sandra exchanged names with the man, and with that simple gesture, they embarked on a lengthy conversation. Shortly afterward, they went to the man's apartment where he made sexual advances towards Sandra. However, Max arrived, pretending to be her irate boyfriend. He confronted the man and questioned his intentions. Sandra diffused the situation and convinced the man to return to the bar. As soon as the man was gone, Sandra wore a radiant smile, basking in her success. Max praised her natural abilities and quick, composed thinking. Max proceeded to steal cash and diamond earrings from the man's apartment, adorning Sandra with the stolen earrings. In a gesture of gratitude, Sandra kissed Max. Max arrived at a party in a car and spotted Madeline, who introduced him to Richard as her son. However, Max blurted out that Richard seemed old. Madeline took Max aside, explaining Richard's public status and advising him to tone it down. Feeling frustrated, Max asked his mom to stop being so motherly. Later, he requested to stay with her for a while. However, Madeline agreed, but with the condition that it wouldn't be for long. The next morning, Madeline asked Max if they could have lunch together, and Max agreed to the invitation. When she left the apartment, Max took the opportunity to talk to Richard and apologized for the events of the previous night. Richard, showing understanding and grace, suggested that since they would be a part of each other's lives in the future, they should make the best of it. He then invited Max to a benefit event that evening for the Richard Hobbs Foundation, which his late wife had founded, emphasizing their charitable contributions. However, Max declined the invitation. After the benefit, Madeline and Richard returned home filled with happiness. However, their joy was short-lived when they spotted a police officer at their doorway, inquiring if Max lived there. It turned out that Max had solicited drugs from an undercover officer earlier, and the police mentioned that he had multiple offenses. They proceeded to handcuff Max, but Richard swiftly intervened. He claimed to know the officer's boss and offered a substantial sum of money to make the situation vanish. Just when it seemed that Richard had saved the day, Madeline intervened, revealing that the police officer wasn't real, as it had all been a ruse, orchestrated by Max. Madeline's anger flared as she scolded Max for humiliating her in front of Richard, and she slapped him in frustration. She ordered Max to leave, making it clear she didn't want to see him in her apartment anymore. Later that night, Madeline knocked on Max's apartment door. Max opened the door and Madeline apologized for hitting him earlier. Shockingly, Madeline kissed him passionately. It turns out that they were just pretending to be mother and son, but actually, they were lovers. He asked Madeline if she liked Richard, to which she replied, "Of course, he's a billionaire." She then informed Max that Richard wanted to meet him in his office the following day. She assured Max not to be jealous, explaining that she didn't have romantic feelings for older men. The next day, Max went to see Richard in his office. As they entered, Richard was surprised to see Tom, his son. Richard inquired about Tom's visit, to which Tom simply replied that he wanted to see him, and then swiftly left the building. Moving forward, Richard offered Max a job in his company with a substantial salary, hoping that Max would leave his mother and end their relationship, which had caused her anguish. Max, however, had a condition. He wanted a year's salary up front. Richard, eager to make Max disappear from their lives, agreed to his demand, as long as Max promised to leave them alone. After receiving the money, Max celebrated at a bar. Madeline joined him with a smile, and they danced together joyfully, as they have successfully swindled Richard. Afterwards, Madeline informed Max that she was going home to gather her belongings and planned to leave Richard first thing in the morning. Later that morning, Madeline called Max to share surprising news. Richard loved her and wanted to marry her, so she decided not to leave him. Tired of a life of deception, she unexpectedly sent the police to Max's place, forcing Max to make a quick escape through another exit from his apartment. Madeline wept before a mirror, grief-stricken as they held a memorial service for Richard, who had passed away. Tom, Richard's son, was present at the service, and discussions about Richard's last will took place with his lawyer. Surprisingly, Richard had left the majority of his estate to Madeline. However, Tom would maintain control of the Richard Hobbs Foundation charity. Everything else, including property, assets, shares, stocks, and the remaining $9.2 billion, was bequeathed to Madeline. Tom assumed the role of chairman for the foundation, while Madeline became a trustee. Madeline requested a private moment with Tom, expressing her apologies and assuring him of their partnership and support. She confided in him, admitting that she couldn't bear to stay in the apartment alone and intended to sell it. After Tom left, Madeline's demeanor changed, and she couldn't contain her delight, smiling cunningly and giggling in happiness. The following day, Madeline indulged in luxury shopping and met with her affluent friends. As the story progresses, Pat and his associates visited Madeline with a business matter involving Tom. Madeline inquired about the nature of the business, and Tom explained that they needed help finding a young woman named Sandra, who had committed a theft. Pat believed that Sandra couldn't have pulled it off alone, and suspected she had an accomplice due to the sophistication of the crime. At nightfall, Madeline prepared dinner, specifically for Tom. During the meal, she inquired if they had made any progress in finding Sandra. Tom responded with disappointment, explaining that their lead in Miami had turned out to be a dead end. Madeline then tried to comfort Tom, suggesting that locating Sandra might not bring him the satisfaction he was seeking. However, Tom disagreed. Thereafter, Madeline informed Tom that she began searching for apartments downtown near his bookstore, wanting to ease his commute. Tom, however, asserted that he didn't need her to do it for him and told her to leave him alone, stating that she wasn't his mother. Madeline, undeterred, retorted that if she were his mother, she'd advise him to grow up. She reminded Tom that most kids weren't entitled enough to hire people to find someone who had stolen from them. Tom confessed that he wanted to find Sandra not just for the money, but because he wanted to see her again. The next morning, Madeline and Tom went to visit the apartment with the agent. However, Tom received a phone call informing him that they had located Sandra and were bringing her to the apartment. Tom then rushed to the apartment to see her. After seeing Sandra, Tom decided that she would stay in the apartment for the time being. Madeline, however, coldly refused, expressing her concern about Sandra's drug addiction. Tom insisted that Sandra had to stay, but Madeline countered that if she were to stay, she needed to talk to Sandra first. Right after that, Madeline introduced herself as Tom's stepmother, but Sandra dismissed her and accused her of deceit. Sandra revealed that Max had disclosed everything about Madeline, their scheme to fool the wealthy billionaire, and their manipulation of Tom to secure the inheritance. Madeline inquired about Sandra's desires, and she demanded to see Max, threatening to expose Madeline as a fraud and a con artist if she didn't comply. Madeline, cornered by the situation, eventually agreed to let Sandra stay. Consequently, Madeline sent a voice message to Max, urgently informing him that Sandra was in her apartment and knew everything about her, insisting that he needed to call her as soon as possible. In response, Max texted Madeline, acknowledging that he had followed her instructions to help secure the money, but expressing his reluctance to get further involved in her problems. Madeline persisted, expressing her desire to have Max back. Following that, Madeline invited Sandra for a walk, informing her that Max had agreed to meet them. She emphasized that once Sandra got to see Max, she had to leave Madeline alone, as per their agreement. They hailed a taxi to go to Max's location, and in an emotionally charged encounter, Sandra angrily confronted Max for abandoning her. She asked him if he had any feelings for her, to which Max coldly replied that he felt nothing. Unexpectedly, Tom, Pat, and his associates arrived on the scene, leaving Madeline feeling nervous. To her surprise, Tom had known all along that Madeline had deceived his father to inherit his entire fortune. Pat urged Madeline to return the money to Tom, but she adamantly refused, declaring that it was all her money, which she intended to use against them. Tensions escalated as Tom grabbed Pat's gun and pointed it at Sandra, accusing her of being motivated solely by money. In a heated exchange, Tom turned the gun on Madeline, revealing that he is mad at her for deceiving his father. Just as Tom was about to shoot Madeline, Sandra managed to disarm him. Madeline then took control of the gun, warning Tom to stay back. Tom, however, insisted that Madeline should shoot him, and in a split second she shot him accidentally. Pat then instructed one of his men to report the incident to the police, but Madeline pleaded with him, vowing to make amends. She promised to return the money and donate it to the foundation, expressing her desire to avoid going to jail for a crime she didn't commit. Madeline urgently called her lawyer, insisting on transferring her inheritance to Richard Hobbs Foundation, with the request that it be completed on the same day. They swiftly booked a flight to Oklahoma City to put distance between themselves and their recent troubles. While on the plane, Madeline informed Max that although she had successfully transferred the inheritance to the foundation, she still has full control of the money as Tom is already dead, and she is the trustee of the foundation. Sandra, overwhelmed by their relentless fixation on money even after Tom's death, couldn't bear it any longer and abruptly left her seat. Shortly after, Madeline realized that the blood on her sleeves was not real as it came off too easily. Discovering that Tom was still alive, and she had been fooled into giving away the entire inheritance, Madeline rushed to search for Sandra. However, Sandra had already disappeared from the plane, and she was nowhere to be found. Sandy boldly walked towards the airport's exit, revealing that she had been involved on the scheme from the beginning with Max as her guide. Becoming aware that Tom had been scammed by Max and Madeline, she approached him and offered a heartfelt apology for her part in the deception. Afterward, Tom, Sandy, and Pat meticulously planned and practiced their strategy to confront and deal with Madeline and Max. They even used fake blood to coordinate their actions perfectly, rehearsing every detail to ensure a flawless execution. In the final scene, Sandy made her way to the bookstore. There, she extended an invitation to Tom for dinner at a Japanese restaurant on Mott Street, and he accepted the invitation.